We're going to talk about operations with radicals, so adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing, and it's section 7.1 in your book if you want to refer back to that. So you have 3 VICs, one for each thing or each operation that we're going to talk about. When you're adding or subtracting, you have to remember that you have to have the same number under the radical in order to add or subtract. So that number under the radical has to be the same, and it's going to stay the same when you add. You're just going to add the numbers out front. When multiplying, you're going to multiply the outside with the outside and the inside with the inside. And when you're dividing, you want to multiply by the conjugate of the denominator. And we're going to go through and show you an example of each one of these and what those VICs mean in terms of actually performing that operation. So our first example is 2 radical 5 plus radical 80. And 5 and 80 aren't the same number, but you can simplify radical 80. Radical 80 simplifies to radical 16 and radical 5. And then the square root of 16 is 4. So when I simplify this, which you should always do first, make sure everything's in simplest form, I end up with a 4 radical 5. So now when I go to say 2 radical 5 plus 4 radical 5, I can actually add those. And I add my two numbers out front. 2 plus 4 is 6, and the number under the radical stays. So I have 6 radical 5. In example 2, we're multiplying. We're going to distribute this 2 radical 5. So I have 2 radical 5 times radical 3 minus 6 radical 8. And so when I distribute, I want to multiply outside with outside. So I have a 2 times a 1 right here. So since there's no number, there's a 1. So 2 times 1 is 2. And then multiply under the radical. 5 times 3 is 15. So I get 2 radical 15 here. And then 2 times 6 is 12. 5 times 8 is 40, so I get minus 12 radical 40. And then you want to simplify. You always want to simplify. So 40 can be broken up into 4 and 10. Since 4 is your perfect square, that's a 2. So my 2 radical 15 stays because 15 is already in simplest form. It can't be simplified anymore. Minus 12 times 2, coming from your square root of 4, radical 10. And then you want to multiply these together. So you have 2 radical 15 minus 24 radical 10. 15 and 10 are not the same number, so you can't combine those anymore. If they were, then you would want to subtract, but we're going to leave it as is for now, or right now, because they're not the same. And our last example is one with division. So I have 7 over radical 3 minus 1, and you can't have this radical in the denominator, which you know, so you have to multiply by the conjugate. And the conjugate is whatever this is with the sign changed. So my 7 over radical 3 minus 1, I'm going to multiply numerator and denominator by radical 3 plus 1. In the numerator, I'm going to distribute. So 7 times radical 3 is 7 radical 3. 7 times 1 is 7. So my numerator says 7 radical 3 plus 7. And the denominator, I have radical 3 minus 1 times radical 3 plus 1. And it's like these guys are in parentheses, and you want to FOIL. So I want to do radical 3 times radical 3 to give me radical 9. Radical 3 times 1 gives me 1 radical 3. Negative 1 times radical 3 gives me my negative radical 3. And negative 1 times 1 gives me my negative 1. So you want to actually multiply first, outer, inner, last, and get this denominator. When you're simplifying, your positive radical 3 and your negative radical 3 are going to cancel out. And then the square root of 9 is 3. So the reason you multiply by the conjugate is to get rid of those square roots, and you'll see that it does get rid of them. So my numerator is going to say 7 radical 3 plus 7. My denominator is going to be 3 from that radical 9 minus 1, because I still have that negative 1. And 3 minus 1 is 2. So my final answer is going to be 7 radical 3 plus 7 over 2.